So I've been trying not to read the news too much lately because, well, it's all bad. Shit's a pandemic. But recently, something from my home state of Michigan caught my attention. In the midst of binge reading about the craziness of the anti-stay-at-home protests in the US, a lefty YouTuber tweeted this on the 17th of April. It gave me pause. I'd been in the middle of reading about these protests in Michigan and in other states, and I was angry. You may have seen images from these protests from Michigan to Colorado. People willfully ignoring social distancing orders by being close to each other, shouting in the face of hospital workers, sometimes waving Confederate flags. Maybe Peter Coffin is right. Making fun of people isn't the best way to win them over. But it's hard to empathize with the protesters. What they're doing seems so dangerous, and the reasons for protesting seem silly at best. Until you remember that some of these protests are motivated by legitimate financial reasons. It's also worth looking at why this is happening so frequently in the US and not as frequently in countries in Europe. I have a theory. As a Michigan native living in Poland, it seems easier to get Poles to hand sew their own face masks to match their whole families than it is to get Americans to do, well, anything. Let's unpack what's happening here. For a content warning, I'm somewhere between existential angst/anxiety attack to relief that I can stay at home and not worry about weird guys trying to hug me. And I think we're all in the same boat. Laughing and crying, shitposting memes and ignoring news, compulsively checking in with people we care about, and spending lots of time on Zoom or just napping. So, with that in mind, we're going to do this with lots of memes, no specific numbers about the COVID cases, and the only coffins will be from the Ghana coffin dancers meme. Let's start with Michigan, where the first of these protests took place. On the 13th of March, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer ordered the closure of all public schools K-12. Over the next few days, the size of people gathering was limited, different types of businesses were closed, and by the 23rd of March, she'd issued the stay-at-home order. To me, this was a great move on Whitmer's part. Detroit, with its long history of poverty and poorly maintained infrastructure, has been one of the hardest hit cities in the U.S., outside of New York. Detroit doesn't have the money or the hospital space to deal with an epidemic. It's been heartbreaking to watch a city I love become consumed with the virus. Detroit's convention center, along with suburban malls, has been converted into field hospitals. However, Michigan's governor quickly started having issues with our president. Whitmer criticized Trump's handling of the crisis, in particular, getting medical supplies to states. On the 27th of March, during a press conference about his White House coronavirus task force, Trump responded by saying that state governors should show him appreciation or they wouldn't get supplies, which is not at all what a mob boss or Soviet dictator would say. He then told his vice president, Mike Pence, "Don't call the woman from Michigan."
Don't call the woman in Michigan.
Almost overnight, that phrase was seen emblazoned onto t-shirts and transformed into memes. I bring up this disagreement to highlight one of the reasons I think the Michigan protest happened. Whitmer is a Democrat, and Trump is a Republican who's handling all of this terribly. The same week he was complaining about Whitmer, he also decided the best way to deal with the lack of ventilators in the US was to angry tweet in all caps that GM isn't making ventilators quickly enough. Even though, spoilers, both GM and Ford have been working to convert their factories to produce medical supplies. I mention political parties because I think they're part of the root of these protests, the never-ending yelling match about who's more right or edgy at the moment. From Hillary Clinton's comment in 2016 campaign about Trump supporters being a basket of deplorables to the all-caps shouting between politicians on Twitter. This doesn't feel like dialogue. It feels like a never-ending screaming match to see who can one-up the other in insults and hot-take memes. It's made worse that the US only has two main political parties. Right now, though, I think this back and forth must be put on hold. There's something much more important at stake here. Also, I think it's a great opportunity to show people the problems of capitalism and also issues of having your health care tied to your job. On the 15th of April, the back and forth antagonism came to a head. People gathered in Michigan's capital to protest the stay-at-home orders and accidentally served up some images that quickly went viral. People with signs comparing Whitmer to Adolf Hitler, and this image of a hospital employee talking to a protester. The protest was called Operation Gridlock, and the idea was to cause a traffic jam around the Capitol building. However, the traffic jam was held up some ambulances, and something that apparently people are arguing about. There's an entire Detroit News article devoted to how long the ambulances actually had to wait, and if the protesters put any lives in danger. If the protesters were black, or native, or Arab, or any other color than white, I really don't think the protests in Michigan would have gone down the way they did. And I cannot believe we're discussing if it's okay to hold up ambulances during a global pandemic. Keep in mind, the protest was called Operation Gridlock. Its entire point was to hold up traffic. I should really mention the recent protest in Michigan where armed men literally stormed the Capitol. However, for the sake of my sanity and this video, I'm going to focus on the original stay-at-home protests. The ones with the pic of armed men storming around the Capitol while state senators live tweeted about how they're glad they're wearing bulletproof vests just isn't something I can think about. And besides, these protests were organized by different groups. It's very tempting to put all these protests into one basket, but I think that's a mistake. Because I think there are some people we could possibly try to reach here and understand their point of view, and maybe show them the benefits of socialism. The country I live in, Poland, like most of Europe, is under some pretty serious lockdown measures, and I'm completely okay with that. I may grumble about it, but I've learned how to complain in a foreign language while wearing a mask to people standing 2 meters away. I'd rather err on the side of caution here and on the side of scientists. There's a quote that says, "A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic," by Joseph Stalin. Turns out, when it's our death, or the death of our grandparents or elderly neighbors, or the older woman who works at the fruit and vegetable stand down the street, or even people that we don't know but our friends and family know, it's a little different. It's a lot different. It's hundreds of thousands of tragedies. And that's why the protesters' attitudes have been so jaw-dropping. I mean, who wants to risk their lives for the economy? But is it just the abstract idea of the economy? I don't think so. I think we really need to unpack the thought process behind these protests. While some of them have been about politics, Michigan's was organized by Michigan Conservative Coalition, founded by Michigan State Rep. Matt Maddock, a Republican. Not all the groups have been so partisan. For example, the group Reopen Pennsylvania, founded by Kirk Durbin, was formed initially to protect small businesses and wanted to focus on things like letter writing campaigns to politicians. Another Michigan group, called Michiganders Against Excessive Quarantine, also talked about the economic impact of stay-at-home orders. These are not all rich, wealthy people upset they can't get a haircut. Which is something a lot of the responses to these protests seem to miss. Yes, it's fun to laugh at the woman in Colorado yelling at the hospital worker who's blocking her massive truck. But if you listen to what she's saying, one of the things she mentions is being able to go back to work. Is she being reckless and absurd? Yes. But is there a non-absurd reason to why she's panicking? Also yes. There actually is a valid point here about small businesses struggling and the slow response of the U.S. government to financially support people. The government hasn't been that quick to start giving people financial help, and while the $1,200 relief checks Trump authorized aren't nothing, it's not going to be enough for many families. Further, I know that many Americans are not happy with the idea of financial help from the government. Help from the government? You mean welfare. You mean handouts. You mean like a nanny state. No, that's gross. It's also important to remember that federal financial help directed at small business didn't come until the 23rd of April, more than a month after Michigan went into lockdown. I think that a lot of Americans are panicking for two reasons. One, our healthcare is literally tied to our jobs. No job? No doctor. That will make anyone freak out, especially in the midst of a global pandemic. Also, our society is very focused on the idea of being self-reliant and linking productivity with self-worth. We like to think we're all independent and can get along without help from anyone else. As for being idle, it's been beaten into our heads that taking time off is something we have to earn or justify. That having a job or having work to do is seen as something shameful that we should fix immediately. You got time to lean? You got time to clean.
We gotta work. Gonna go broke. Gotta work.
There's also a difference between Texas Governor Greg Abbott saying there are some things more important than living when talking about reopening the state's economy than to protesters concerned about making ends meet. While I think that the protesters demanding haircuts are incredibly misguided, I don't think that laughing at them is going to help. Before making fun of the protesters, I think it's important to acknowledge that some of them are panicking for financial reasons. If you look at this list of Michigan businesses that supported the April 15th protest, it's not surprising that a lot had to do with gardening. This was because there was some confusion if gardening supplies were considered non-essential and which stores were impacted by Governor Whitmer's orders. Yes, gardening stores with a certain square footage could remain open. And yes, it's been snowing in Michigan, meaning that early April is a bad time to plant anything. However, I think the original concern about finances has snowballed into a bizarre group of people shouting about their rights, with some racism and anti-Semitism thrown in for some bigoted flavor. Which leads me to my final point. Why are Americans like this? And so now our timeline has conservative men tweeting "my laws, my body" without a hint of irony. And if any men are upset about the face mask rule, I invite you to sit in a park with me, topless. We can live stream the results and see what happens. And for the record, there have been small protests in Berlin and at this town on the Polish-German border over the stay-at-home restrictions. In all seriousness, why are we like this? What has driven a small percentage of Americans to lose their collective shit? Because it's only around 20%. This Kaiser Health poll found 80% of Americans support the shutdown. So, time for a quick history lesson. America gets its cultural heritage from, of course, the British, and, wait for it, the Native Americans. In particular, the Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee, had a big part in shaping what would become American culture. For example, the colonists dressed up like the Mohawk tribe, one of the Six Nations tribes, to throw tea into the harbor. And why? Well, to them, the natives represented the idea of freedom, because the Haudenosaunee societies were more egalitarian than British society was at that time. Think British aristocracy and the idea of the royal family. The Haudenosaunee had a confederacy of multiple tribes that voted, while the Brits had a king. So, on one side we have Europeans with the Magna Carta and the vague history of democracy in Greece, and on the other we have the Iroquois who valued social equality and had their own constitution. Toss them together, and that's how you get Americans. And Americans love the idea of freedom and the illusion of choice. It's why we embrace the notion that anyone can become a millionaire. Maybe we can get rich too if we just work hard enough. It's why we love the idea of freedom, even if we're kind of hazy on what that actually means. Like a lot of people, I'd rather stay at home until scientists agree it's safe to stop social distancing. Sure, I'm giving up on my freedom to wander around and buy stuff, but by doing so, I'm keeping my right to stay more or less healthy and to not spread the virus. And that's a choice I'm willing to make. And it's an idea that seems lost in the melee of Twitter shouting matches and sassy memes. This isn't all just people mad they can't go to Applebee's. There are some people concerned with making rent and paying bills. It wasn't just Peter Coffin's tweet that gave me pause. It was his interview with a photographer from the Ohio State House who captured this image of people crowded around empty windows, yelling about how the economy should reopen in Ohio. Some carried American flags. One man had a MAGA hat on. A Polish friend described it as violently American. People on Twitter took the picture and made it into a meme with a zombie movie reference. Confession, I did the same. The photographer said he wasn't comfortable with his usage. They were just people panicking during a global health crisis. I admit I'm biased here, and I've got some strong feelings about this. I've lost family members about arguments about politics, specifically my right-wing family members. While I'm concerned about my right-wing family in Michigan, they're not following social distancing, and as people over age 60, they're in that high-risk group, there's nothing I can do. And I know that. Even if we were talking, I know our conversation would quickly become a shouting match about why AOC hadn't supported that small businesses bailout I previously mentioned. Spoilers, she didn't think it was enough money. Last, the US president is saying incredibly stupid, contradictory things. Forget the bleach memes. After insisting that states should reopen, Trump is now backpedaling, just as the state of Georgia plans to reopen. This is beyond insane. Personally, I think the United States should follow Seattle's lead and stop broadcasting the president live. We need time to fact-check what Trump blathers before anyone hears him, and worse, believes him. This is beyond jokes about drinking Lysol. Trump is consistently trying to deny things he previously said. Can someone at least make sure Trump is sleeping enough? Maybe give him a glass of water, because this is beyond his normal level of ignorant. I'm not saying that we should give anyone a pass for demanding other people risk their lives by returning to work or for carrying Confederate flags. But I am feeling a little overwhelmed and running low on emotional spoons. So maybe, before you share that meme or get into a shouting match on Twitter, maybe offer them some socialism in this trying time. Last, I'm going to leave you with some words of wisdom from Canadian comedian Red Green.
Remember, I'm pulling for you. We're all in this together.
So special thanks to Brianna Stallings, my script advisor, and Jacek Bohanek for letting me bounce some ideas off him. And special thanks to Enviada Monteras, who let me use her very awesome video for the end.